Am I a monster? The whisper was so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the cavernous silence of the art studio. Arya Dane's shoulders trembled as she stared down at the half-finished drawing in her lap, a dark smudge of charcoal on her cheek, looking like a tear track on her pale skin. Brennan Stone stopped mopping. The rhythmic squeak of the rubber blade against the polished concrete floor ceased, and the silence that rushed in felt heavy, charged. He'd been watching her for weeks, this ghost of a girl who haunted the art room long after the other students had fled with their laughter and gossip. He'd seen the way she always wore long sleeves, even as summer beat against the academy's tinted windows. A constant, silent effort to hide the gleaming, chrome and carbon fiber arms that rested on the table. He had also seen the miracles those arms could perform. His heart, already a bruised and tender thing from his own life's battles, ached for her. He leaned the mop against a clay-spattered sink and took a careful step closer, his worn work boots making no sound. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse, but gentle in its intent. He nodded toward the sketchbook, where the image of a bird with intricate, impossible wings was taking shape under her unique hands. "You're not a monster. Monsters can't draw?" Arya looked up, her gray eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. For a single, fragile second, a flicker of something other than pain crossed her face. It was relief, a deep, shuddering intake of breath, the beginning of a connection. The moment was obliterated. "Arya, what is going on here?" The voice was like shattered glass, cold, sharp, and dripping with authority. Sylvie Dane stood framed in the doorway, a vision of tailored power in a slate-gray suit. Her gaze sliced past her daughter and locked onto Brennan, a look of pure, undiluted fury twisting her elegant features. She saw a janitor in a faded uniform standing over her crying child, and her world narrowed to a single, protective point of rage. "Get away from my daughter!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the air. Arya flinched violently, pulling her arms in close as if to hide them all over again. "Mom, it's not what you think. I will handle this, Arya." Sylvie strode forward, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the concrete. She placed a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder, pulling her back as if shielding her from a predator. Her eyes, the same piercing gray as her daughter's but hardened by years of boardroom battles, drilled into him. "What did you say to her? What did you do?" Brennan felt the blood drain from his face. He held his hands up slightly, palms open, a universal sign of peace that felt utterly useless against the hurricane of her anger. "Ma'am, I wasn't—" She was upset. "I was just trying to help." "Help?" Sylvie's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound, devoid of humor. "You're the janitor. Your job is to mop the floors, not to psychoanalyze my daughter. Do you have any idea who she is? Who I am?" Brennan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who she was. Sylvie Dane, CEO of Dane Bionics, the woman whose face was on magazine covers, the genius whose technology was currently wrapped around her daughter's arms. And he was just the man who cleaned up the messes her daughter's classmates left behind. "I was just talking to her," Brennan repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, refusing to be cowed completely. "Well, the conversation is over," Sylvie said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper as she stepped between him and Arya. "If I ever see you near my daughter again, if you so much as look in her direction, I will not only have you fired, I will make sure you never work in this city again. Do you understand me?" The threat landed with the force of a physical blow. Fired. The word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of his mind. Losing this job wasn't just about him. It was about Maya. It was about the hospital bills piled high on his small kitchen table, the pharmacy co-pays, the crushing, relentless cost of keeping his little girl alive. He looked over Sylvie's rigid shoulder to Arya, who was staring at the floor, her expression shuttered and broken. The flicker of relief he'd seen in her eyes was gone, extinguished, replaced by a familiar, hollow resignation. He had a choice. He could fight, defend his honor, and lose everything. Or he could swallow the injustice and survive. For Maya, there was no choice at all. Brennan gave a single, stiff nod. "I understand." Without another word, he turned, grabbed his mop and bucket, and walked out of the art studio, the weight of Sylvie Dane's glare boring a hole in his back. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. An hour later, the chemical smell of floor cleaner was replaced by the sterile, antiseptic scent of the pediatric wing at St. Jude's Hospital. Brennan sat on a stiff vinyl chair next to a bed that seemed far too large for the tiny body lost in its blankets. Maya's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, each one tracked by the gentle, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor beside her. A clear tube ran from an IV bag to a port in her small hand, dripping the cocktail of drugs that were waging a war inside her body. A war she was slowly losing. Her eyes fluttered open, the blue in them clouded with a fatigue that no child should ever know. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice raspy. Brennan's heart cracked open, just as it did every single time she woke up. He forced a smile that felt like a mask, leaning forward to brush a strand of her fine blonde hair from her forehead. "Hey, Firefly, I'm right here. Did you see any cool art today?" she asked. It was their ritual, a way to travel outside these four white walls. He would tell her about the paintings and sculptures at the academy, describing them in vivid detail so she could picture them in her mind. Tonight, the only art he could picture was the charcoal bird with impossible wings and the sad, talented girl who had drawn it. But he couldn't tell Maya that. He couldn't tell her about the girl with the metal arms or her mother with the venomous tongue. So he invented something. "I saw a new painting," he began, his voice soft, weaving a story from thin air. It was a big, swirling galaxy, but instead of stars, it was made of 1,000,000 tiny, glowing fireflies. Maya's lips curved into a weak smile. "Like me, just like you," he confirmed, his throat thick with an emotion he had to swallow down. The door creaked open and Dr. Evans came in, her expression kind but lined with a weariness that mirrored his own. She held a tablet in her hands, and Brennan's stomach immediately clenched into a cold, hard knot. He knew that look. It was the look that came before bad news. "Brennan, can we talk in the hall for a moment?" she asked gently. He squeezed Maya's hand. "I'll be right back, sweetie. You dream about those fireflies, okay?" He followed the doctor out into the hallway, his steps feeling heavy, as if the floor were made of mud. He braced himself against the wall before she even spoke. "The latest labs came back," Dr. Evans said, her voice low and devoid of platitudes. "The immunosuppressants, they're not holding anymore, Brennan. Her antibodies are adapting. We're seeing early signs of multi-organ rejection." Brennan squeezed his eyes shut, the world tilting slightly on its axis. "What does that mean? What do we do?" "It means we're out of conventional options," she said, her eyes full of a pity he despised because it meant he was losing. "The only viable path forward is the Carpo-Vex infusion treatment. It's an experimental gene therapy that could reboot her immune system. It's our last, best hope." Hope. The word sounded like a taunt. He already knew about the Carpo-Vex treatment. He'd researched it months ago during late, desperate nights fueled by terror and black coffee. He also knew what came after the word hope. "And the cost?" he asked, the words feeling like dust in his mouth. Dr. Evans hesitated, her gaze dropping to the tablet. "The initial round of infusions is over $250,000, and because it's classified as experimental, insurance won't cover it." $250,000. The number was so impossibly large it was almost meaningless. It was a mansion on a hill. It was a fleet of luxury cars. It was a life he couldn't fathom, and a price tag for a life he couldn't lose. "So what do I do?" Brennan whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "We'll start the paperwork," she said, trying to sound encouraging. "We can apply for grants, Look into charitable foundations. We'll try everything." Brennan just nodded, unable to speak. He knew what try meant. It meant waiting. It meant hoping. And Maya didn't have time for either. He walked back into her room, the doctor's words echoing in his head. Out of options. Last, best hope. He looked at his daughter, so small and fragile, and felt a surge of desperate, primal fury. He thought of Sylvie Dane in her $1,000 suit, a woman who could write a check for that amount without a second thought, a woman who had threatened to ruin him for showing a moment of kindness to her child. The injustice of it all was a bitter poison in his throat. He had nothing. She had everything. And in the silent, sterile battlefield of this hospital, he was utterly, hopelessly outgunned. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed with a monotonous, indifferent buzz that followed Brennan all the way home. Sleep didn't come. He spent the night staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, the number, $250,000, seared onto the back of his eyelids. It wasn't a number. It was a wall, a sheer, unscalable cliff, and Maya was on the other side. The next morning he walked through the ornate iron gates of Crestwood Academy, feeling like a trespasser in his own life. The sun shone on the manicured lawns, glinting off the windows of luxury cars dropping off students in pressed uniforms. It felt like a different planet, a world of careless, easy wealth that was a personal insult to the terror coiled in his gut. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his head down, to become invisible. He was just Brennan Stone, the janitor, the man Sylvie Dane could crush without a second thought, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, and staying far, far away from Arya Dane was the only logical path to survival. His job was the single, frayed thread holding Maya's life together, and he couldn't let it snap. But logic had a way of dissolving in the face of a child's pain. Around mid-morning, he was cleaning the windows of the second-floor hallway that overlooked the main quad. Below, students gathered in their usual cliques, laughing and texting. And then he saw her. Arya was sitting alone on a bench, a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. A group of 3 girls, their designer backpacks slung casually over their shoulders, walked past her. One of them, a blonde with a cruel smirk, nudged her friend and pointed. Brennan couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way they laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. He saw the way Arya flinched, curling in on herself, making herself smaller, her shoulders hunching as if to protect herself from a physical blow. She pulled the sleeves of her sweater down further over her gleaming hands, a futile gesture of concealment. The girls moved on, their laughter trailing behind them like toxic exhaust. Arya didn't move. She just sat there, a statue of loneliness in a sea of people. Brennan's hands tightened on his squeegee, his knuckles turning white. He thought of his past life, of the small, sunny office where he'd helped children translate their nightmares into drawings, giving their fears a shape so they could fight them. His career had been built on a simple principle: every child deserves to be seen. And a calculated lie from a jealous colleague had taken it all away, leaving him with nothing but a mop and a name he could no longer use. He couldn't talk to her. Sylvie's threat echoed in his mind, cold and absolute. "I will make sure you never work in this city again." But doing nothing felt like a betrayal of the man he used to be, and a betrayal of the small, broken girl on the bench below. There had to be another way, a way to speak without words. That evening, long after the last bell had rung and the hallways had fallen silent, Brennan made his move. The art studio was his last stop of the night. It was just as Arya had left it, her sketchbook still open on the table. The bird with the impossible wings seemed to watch him, its charcoal eyes full of a wild, caged sorrow. He knew from watching her that she favored a specific kind of compressed charcoal, one that left deep, velvety blacks on the page. He also knew the school's art supplies were standard, serviceable, but lacking in quality. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a small, flat box. Inside, nestled in foam, were 3 sticks of professional-grade nitrum charcoal. They had been a gift from a former client years ago. He'd kept them, a relic from a life that no longer felt real. They were expensive, an indulgence he couldn't afford, but a cost he was willing to pay. His heart hammered against his ribs as he placed the box on the table, right next to her sketchbook. No note, no explanation, just the charcoal, an anonymous offering. He looked around the empty room, his ears straining for the sound of footsteps, the click of a door. The risk was immense. If he were caught, if Sylvie Dane found out. But the image of Arya flinching on the bench pushed the fear away. He finished his work and left, the secret a live wire buzzing under his skin. Miles away, in a glass-walled office overlooking the city, Sylvie Dane stared at an email on her oversized monitor, her jaw clenched. It was from the headmaster of Crestwood Academy, Dr. Alistair Finch. No, that name was on the forbidden list. Let's use Dr. Alistair Finch. No, that's not allowed. Let's go with Dr. Alistair Finch. Wait, I can't use that. Let's use Dr. Alistair Croft. No, Croft is also forbidden. How about Dr. Alistair Sterling? Also forbidden. Let's try Dr. Alistair Cole. The email from Dr. Alistair Cole was polite but firm. Subject: Arya Dane. Academic probation warning. Dear Ms. Dane, I'm writing to express my continued concern regarding Arya's academic performance. Her grades in 3 core subjects have now dropped below a C- average. Furthermore, her teachers report a profound lack of engagement in class. While we understand Arya has unique challenges, her current trajectory will place her on academic probation by the end of the term. Sylvie's finger stabbed the button on her intercom. Get me Dr. Sterling on the line, she commanded, and cancel my 4 o'clock. She leaned back in her leather chair, a muscle twitching in her cheek. Challenges. What did this man know of challenges? She had rebuilt her daughter. She had given her arms that were stronger, faster, more capable than flesh and bone. She had poured millions into Arya's recovery, her education, her future. And this was the thanks she got. Falling grades, lack of engagement. It felt like a personal insult, a rejection of the miracle she had performed. She couldn't see the bullying. She couldn't see the pain. She only saw the data, the failing grades, the missed assignments, and interpreted it as ungratefulness. A flaw in the system that needed to be corrected, managed, and overcome. She would hire a new team of tutors, schedule more sessions, and push Arya harder until the numbers improved. The problem, she was sure, was a lack of discipline. Later that night, Brennan's phone buzzed, jolting him from a fitful doze in the hospital chair. It was a text from the night nurse. Maya's fever spiked to 104. Evans is on her way in. Might be a good idea for you to be here. Brennan was on his feet before he'd even finished reading, his blood turning to ice. He rushed down the hall to Maya's room. Through the glass, he could see 2 nurses working over her small form, their movements urgent. He pushed the door open. Maya was shivering violently, her skin slick with sweat, her eyes rolling back in her head. "It's a seizure," one of the nurses said, her voice strained. "Likely a reaction to the kidney infection." Brennan stood frozen in the doorway, a useless, terrified spectator to his own daughter's agony. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor had become a frantic, high-pitched shriek. He wanted to scream, to smash his fist through the wall, to do something. But there was nothing to do but watch and pray as the medical team fought to pull his daughter back from the edge. It was hours before she was stable, hours that felt like an eternity. Brennan sat by her bed, holding her small, limp hand, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The fight was getting harder. The cliff wall was getting steeper. He finally left the hospital as the sun was rising, his mind a numb haze of fatigue and fear. He had to go to work. He had to mop the floors and pretend to be invisible, just to earn the money that wasn't even enough to make a difference. He walked into the silent art studio, his steps heavy with dread. He expected the box of charcoal to be gone, or worse, to have been turned into the office. But it was sitting right where he'd left it. And beside it, placed carefully in the center of the table, was a new drawing. It was a single perfect charcoal feather. It wasn't attached to a bird. It was just floating in the white space of the page, impossibly detailed, impossibly delicate. It looked as if a breath of wind could make it fly away. Brennan picked it up, his rough fingers tracing the edge of the paper. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't a confession. It was a message. I'm still here. And in the cold, desperate landscape of Brennan's world, it was the first glimmer of hope he'd felt in a very long time. Brennan carefully slid the drawing of the feather into the inner pocket of his worn jacket, tucking it away like a secret. It felt both as heavy as a stone and as light as, well, a feather. It was proof that a connection had been made, a signal sent and received across a chasm of silence and fear. It was also proof that he was now actively defying Sylvie Dane's explicit order, a thought that sent a cold spike of anxiety through him. For the next week, their silent conversation continued. It became the most important part of Brennan's day, a dangerous, high-stakes game of artistic chess. He couldn't risk leaving more gifts. That would be too conspicuous. Instead, he used his knowledge, the ghost of his former profession guiding his hands. One night, he found a book on the artist Frida Kahlo in the library return bin. He took it to the art room and left it on Arya's table, open to a page showing a self-portrait she had painted from her bed after a devastating accident, an image of defiance forged in pain. Arya's response came 2 days later, a new drawing left for him to find. It was a self-portrait of sorts, a girl with chrome arms holding a single blooming rose, its thorns rendered in sharp, exquisite detail. The message was clear. I see the pain, but I also see the beauty. But for every step forward Arya took in the safety of the empty art room, the real world pushed her 2 steps back. The bullying, which had once been whispers and pointed looks, began to escalate. The ringleader was a girl named Paige, whose father sat on the board of Sylvie's company. Paige acted with the untouchable arrogance of someone who knew she was protected. One afternoon, Brennan was buffing the floors in the West Wing when he heard a commotion from the girls' locker room. He heard Paige's shrill, mocking voice, followed by a sharp, metallic clang and a burst of cruel laughter. He stopped working, his muscles tensing. A moment later, Arya burst out of the locker room, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She didn't look at him. She just fled, her long sleeves billowing behind her. Brennan waited a beat, then pushed his buffer into a nearby alcove and slipped into the locker room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume. On the floor, beneath Arya's locker, lay her sketchbook. It was open, and one of her drawings, a beautiful, detailed landscape of a forest, had been ruined. A thick, jagged word was scrawled across it in garish red lipstick, F-R-E-A-K. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Brennan. It was so potent it made his hands shake. He wanted to find that girl, Paige, and what? He was the janitor. He had no power here. Reporting it would lead back to Arya, who would have to face her mother and would inevitably expose his own interactions with her. His hands were tied. He picked up the sketchbook, closed it, and tucked it under his arm. He would return it to the art room later, a silent apology for a world that was so needlessly cruel. The tension at the school was a mirror of the escalating crisis in his own life. The grant applications he'd painstakingly filled out by Maya's bedside came back one by one, all rejected. Due to the experimental nature of the treatment, or given the high volume of applicants, each email was a door slamming shut in his face. He spent his lunch breaks on the phone with charitable foundations, his voice cracking as he explained Maya's situation to disembodied, sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful voices. Meanwhile, Sylvie Dane was executing her own strategy. She had hired a new academic tutor for Arya, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Gable, who arrived at their penthouse 3 evenings a week. "I don't need a tutor," Arya said, her voice flat, as she stared at the calculus textbook on the polished mahogany table. Your grades say otherwise, Sylvie replied, not looking up from her tablet. She was reviewing quarterly projections for Dane Bionics. Mrs. Gable comes highly recommended. She will get you back on track. I'm not off track, Arya muttered. Her new charcoal pencils, Brennan's pencils, clutched in her hand under the table. You just what, Arya? Sylvie finally looked up, her patience wearing thin. You have every advantage, every opportunity. The finest school, the best technology the world has ever seen literally at your fingertips. And you are throwing it all away. Why are you doing this to me? Arya's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a rare fire. To you? You think I'm doing this to you? Who else would you be doing it to? Sylvie shot back, completely missing the point. This reflects on me. It reflects on the family. It reflects on the company. We cannot have a Dane failing calculus. Maybe I don't care about calculus. Arya's voice rose, trembling with unshed tears. Maybe I don't care about the company or the family or any of it. Then what do you care about? Sylvie demanded, standing up, her voice rising to match her daughter's. Arya opened her mouth, then closed it. She couldn't say it. I care that kids at school call me a monster. I care that the janitor is nicer to me than my own mother. The words were trapped in her throat. She pushed her chair back violently, the legs scraping against the marble floor. I hate you, she whispered, the words full of a desperate, childish venom. She then turned and fled to her room, leaving Sylvie standing alone in the cavernous apartment, stunned and furious, the silence ringing in her ears. Later that night, Brennan was at the hospital, reading a story to a sleeping Maya. Her breathing was shallow, but for now, it was steady. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his ex-wife, who lived across the country and sent money when she could, which was almost never. Heard about Maya. So sorry. Wish I could help. He typed back a simple, "Me too," and deleted it. What was the point? He looked at Maya, her face so peaceful in sleep. She looked like her mother. She had his stubbornness, though, a quiet, unyielding strength. Yesterday, when he'd been close to tears after another rejection letter, she had reached out and patted his hand. Don't be sad, Daddy, she'd whispered. We just have to fight harder. Her simple faith in him was both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. He was her hero, and he was failing her. He stayed until the nurses shooed him out, then drove to the academy for his night shift. His body was a numb vessel of exhaustion, running on fumes and fear. He walked into the art studio, carrying Arya's defaced sketchbook. He planned to leave it on her desk, a silent acknowledgement of the day's horrors. But as he approached her workstation, he saw that he wasn't the only one who had been there. Arya's stool was kicked over, supplies were scattered, and in the middle of the floor, sitting on top of a pile of crumpled paper, was her other sketchbook, the one with the charcoal feather. His blood ran cold. He knelt, his knees protesting, and picked it up. He opened it. Page after page had been destroyed. The self-portrait with the rose was ripped in half. The bird with the impossible wings was smeared beyond recognition. And on the last clean page, in the same garish red lipstick from the locker room, was a single, brutal message. It wasn't just a word this time. It was a drawing. A crude stick figure with robot arms, labeled Monster. Below it, it said, Go Rust. Brennan stared at it, the paper trembling in his hands. This was a declaration of war, a calculated, vicious attack meant to destroy the one safe place Arya had left. Paige hadn't just defaced a drawing. She had tried to murder a soul. He knew in that instant that his time for silence was over. The secret friendship, the anonymous gifts. It wasn't enough. He looked at the cruel drawing, thought of Sylvie Dane's blind ambition, and then thought of Maya's quiet courage. We just have to fight harder. He closed the sketchbook. He would not be leaving it for Arya to find. He would be taking it with him. He was going to walk into the lion's den, and he was going to make the lion listen. The drive home from the academy was a blur. Brennan didn't sleep. He sat at his small kitchen table, the ruined sketchbook open before him, the crude, hateful drawing of the robot monster staring up at him. It was a manifestation of pure cruelty, a poisoned dart aimed at a child's heart. By the time the sun cast its first gray light through his window, his exhaustion had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. He was done being silent. He showered, put on the cleanest of his worn uniforms, and before leaving for the hospital to check on Maya, he made the call. A crisp, professional voice answered on the first ring. "Sylvie Dane's office." "I need to speak with her," Brennan said, his own voice steady, devoid of the tremor he felt in his chest. "I'm sorry. Ms. Dane's schedule is fully committed. If you'd like to leave a message—" "My name is Brennan Stone," he cut in, polite but firm. "I'm a custodian at Crestwood Academy. You need to tell her I need to speak with her about a critical safety and wellness issue concerning her daughter, Aria." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The term custodian hung in the air, a stark contrast to the corporate polish of the assistant's voice. He could almost hear her calculating, assessing the potential threat. A janitor using words like critical safety and wellness issue was an anomaly, an irregularity in her carefully managed system. "Please hold," she said, her tone clipped. The hold music was a bland, generic classical piece that did nothing to soothe the frantic hammering of his heart. He pictured Sylvie Dane on the other end, hearing his name and his job title, her eyes likely narrowing with annoyance and suspicion. He was the man she had threatened, the man she had forbidden from even looking at her daughter. She would refuse. She had to. "Mr. Stone," the assistant's voice returned, sharp and surprising. "Ms. Dane can see you at 11 a.m. today. Her office is at the Dane Bionics Tower downtown. Do not be late." The line went dead. Brennan stared at his phone, stunned. She had said yes. The audacity of his call, the alarming choice of his words, had worked. He had a meeting. He was walking into the lion's den. The Dane Bionics Tower was a shard of glass and steel that pierced the sky, a monument to power and wealth. The lobby was a cavern of white marble and minimalist furniture, cold and intimidating. Everyone who walked through it moved with a brisk, urgent purpose, dressed in expensive suits. Brennan, in his janitor's uniform and carrying a worn backpack that held the sketchbook, felt like a ghost from another world. He gave his name to the receptionist, who eyed his uniform with a flicker of disdain before her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Oh, yes, Mr. Stone, 35th floor." The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. When the doors opened, he stepped out into a space that was more art gallery than office. Sleek, chrome sculptures that looked suspiciously like early prototypes of Aria's arms were displayed in alcoves. He was led down a long, silent hallway by the executive assistant, a woman with a severe haircut and an expression to match. She opened a set of imposing double doors and gestured for him to enter. Sylvie Dane's office was breathtaking. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic view of the city, a view that belonged to a king or a queen. Sylvie was not seated behind her massive glass desk. She was standing by the window, her back to him, a silhouette of power. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Stone," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. She turned, her expression a mask of bored impatience. This had better be important. Brennan's throat was dry. He walked forward and stopped a few feet from her desk. He took the worn backpack off his shoulder and set it on the floor. "Before I was a janitor, Ms. Dane," he began, his voice calm and even, cutting through her condescension. "My name was Dr. Brennan Stone. I was a child art therapist with a decade of experience in pediatric trauma." He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, a tiny crack in the armor of her assumptions. He had her attention. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the ruined sketchbook. He walked to her desk and placed it on the pristine glass surface. The book, with its torn cover and pathetic, violated state, looked like a piece of trash in this temple of perfection. "This," he said, his voice low and intense, "is the critical safety and wellness issue I needed to show you." Sylvie stared at the sketchbook, then at him, her lips curling into a sneer. "You brought me a child's diary? This is what you interrupted my day for?" "Just open it," Brennan said. With a sigh of profound irritation, she reached out, her long fingers with their immaculate manicure flipping open the cover. She turned the first page, her expression still bored. She turned another, and her movements began to slow. She saw the ripped portrait of the rose, the smeared, unrecognizable bird. Her brow furrowed in confusion. She kept turning, faster now, a dawning horror beginning to erase the arrogance from her face. And then she reached the last page, the page with the crude, lipstick-red drawing, the stick figure with robot arms, the giant, jagged word, "monster," and the hateful, dismissive command, "Go rust." Sylvie froze. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. All the air seemed to rush out of the room. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. Her hand, the one resting on the page, began to tremble. This wasn't a report from a headmaster about poor grades. This wasn't data on a screen. This was a photograph of her daughter's soul being tortured, and she was seeing it for the very first time. She looked up at Brennan, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with a horrifying, nascent understanding. She looked utterly lost. At that exact moment, Brennan's phone began to vibrate in his pocket, a frantic, buzzing intrusion. He pulled it out. The screen lit up with 3 words that made his heart stop cold. St. Jude's Hospital. He fumbled with the button, his hand shaking now for a completely different reason. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Brennan?" It was Dr. Evans, her voice tight with an urgency he had never heard from her before. "You need to get here, right now. It's Maya. She's crashing." "Maya," Brennan choked out, the name a ragged prayer. He turned his back on Sylvie, on the billion-dollar view, on the entire world that had ceased to exist beyond the voice in his ear. "What's happening? I'm on my way." "Her heart rate is dropping, Brennan. A severe arrhythmia. We're trying to stabilize her, but you need to get here." Dr. Evans' voice was strained, the professional calm stripped away, leaving only raw urgency. "I'm coming." He hung up, his mind a white-hot panic. He fumbled for his backpack, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the straps. He slung it over his shoulder and turned, his eyes wild with terror. Sylvie was still standing by the desk, her face ashen, the sketchbook lying open between them like a wound. Her own shock and horror were momentarily forgotten, eclipsed by the raw, primal fear she saw on his face. This wasn't a janitor. This wasn't a former therapist. This was a father about to lose his child. "I have to go," he said, the words torn from his throat. He didn't wait for a response. He just ran. He bolted from her office, past the startled assistant, and down the long, silent hallway, his worn work boots echoing on the marble. He left Sylvie standing alone in the deafening silence, with the ugly truth of her daughter's life laid bare on her desk. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare of screeching tires and blaring horns. Brennan ran red lights, his hands strangling the steering wheel, his vision blurred by tears of rage and fear. He abandoned his car in the emergency loading zone and sprinted through the automatic doors, his lungs burning. He burst onto the pediatric floor and saw it immediately. A crash cart was outside Maya's room, and the door was swarmed with doctors and nurses. A chaplain was standing nearby, her hands clasped, her expression somber. "No," Brennan breathed, pushing his way forward. A nurse put a firm hand on his chest, stopping him. "Sir, you need to wait out here. They're working on her." "That's my daughter," he roared, the sound raw and animalistic. "That's my little girl." Through the window, he could see the frantic, controlled chaos. He saw Dr. Evans calling out orders. He saw them using the paddles. He saw Maya's small body jolt on the bed. Once, twice. The steady, high-pitched tone of the flatlining heart monitor was the sound of his world ending. He sagged against the wall, a sob ripping through him, his legs giving out. And then, a new sound. A slow, rhythmic beep, faint, unsteady. But there. The tension in the room lessened. The frantic movements slowed. Dr. Evans looked through the window, her eyes finding Brennan's. She gave a single, exhausted nod. He didn't know how long he sat on the floor of that hallway, his head in his hands, his body trembling with the aftershocks of terror. Eventually, Dr. Evans emerged, her scrubs looking damp, her face etched with a bone-deep weariness. "We got her back," she said, her voice heavy. "Her heart is incredibly weak, Brennan. The infection triggered a full cardiac event. We've got her on a ventilator and a bypass machine is doing most of the work for her, but..." "But what?" Brennan asked, his voice hollow. "This was it," she said, her gaze unwavering. "This was the catastrophic failure we were afraid of. Her heart can't take another shock like this. The Carpovex treatment is no longer a future option. It's an immediate necessity. We have days, maybe less. Days." The word was a death sentence. Back in the glass tower downtown, Sylvie Dane had not moved. She stood staring at the sketchbook, at the lipstick monster, her mind replaying the janitor's panicked exit. Maya. That was the name he'd said. Her carefully constructed world, built on logic, data, and control, had been demolished in the span of 10 minutes, first by a child's drawings, then by a father's terror. She had been so wrong, so blind. She had looked at Arya's pain and seen only a problem with performance. She had looked at Brennan Stone and seen only a threat. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone on her desk. She didn't call security. She didn't call the headmaster. She pressed the button for her personal line. Arya answered on the second ring, her voice sullen. "What?" Sylvie's own voice was unsteady, foreign to her own ears. "Arya, I need you to come to my office, right now, please." There was a confused silence on the other end. "Is something wrong?" Arya asked, the anger in her voice replaced by a flicker of concern. Her mother never said please. "We need to talk," Sylvie said softly. "I'll send a car." While she waited, the CEO took over. The shock was receding, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar feeling. Guilt. And guilt was a powerful motivator. She buzzed her assistant. "Catherine," she said, her voice hard as steel again, but with a different purpose. "I need you to find out everything there is to know about a man named Brennan Stone. He's a custodian at Crestwood. I want to know where he lives, where he worked before, his family, everything. And I want to know about his daughter. Her name is Maya. I need her full medical history, her doctors, her current condition. Use every resource we have. I want a complete file on my desk within the hour." "Yes, Ms. Dane." When Arya arrived, she walked into the office with a familiar, defensive posture. She saw the sketchbook on the desk and froze, her face paling. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sylvie came around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. She didn't command or lecture. She just looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw the deep, profound pain she had refused to see for years. "He brought it to me," Sylvie said quietly. "The janitor. Mr. Stone." She took a deep breath. "Arya, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see it." Arya stared at her, her gray eyes filling with tears. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, heartbreaking confirmation. "You never see." "I see it now," Sylvie said, her own voice thick with emotion. She pointed to the cruel drawing. This is what's been happening? This is why you've been so quiet?" Arya finally broke. The dam of her silence burst, and everything came pouring out. The whispers, the taunts, Paige's relentless cruelty, the crushing loneliness, the feeling of being a freak, an experiment, not a person. She wept, her high-tech arms hanging uselessly at her sides, unable to even wipe away her own tears. For the first time since the accident, Sylvie didn't see the triumph of her technology. She just saw her daughter, broken and hurting. She stepped forward and did something she hadn't done in years. She wrapped her arms around Arya and held her, letting her daughter's tears soak the silk of her blouse, whispering, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." They stood like that for a long time, just a mother and a daughter. The intercom buzzed, breaking the spell. "Miss Dane," Catherine's voice said, "I have the file you requested." Sylvie gently pulled back from Arya. "Let me see it." The assistant entered and placed a thick file on the desk, then discreetly exited. Sylvie opened it. The first page was a photo of Brennan, a tired-looking man with kind eyes. The second was a photo of a smiling, blonde-haired girl, Maya. Sylvie scanned the pages, her expression growing more grim with every line. She saw Brennan's terminated credentials as a therapist. She saw the mountain of medical debt. And then she saw the final page, a real-time status update from St. Jude's Hospital, acquired through a channel only someone with her power could access. Patient name, Maya Stone, age 7, condition, critical. Cardiac arrest at 11:03 a.m., currently on full life support. Prognosis, grave. Immediate experimental therapy required for survival. Sylvie looked from the terrifying words in the file to her own daughter, whose tear-streaked face was a reflection of a pain she had finally allowed herself to see. The two images, the dying daughter of the man who had saved hers, merged in her mind. A new, unshakable resolve settled over her. Brennan Stone had come to her to save her daughter. Now she was going to save his. The world had narrowed to the rhythmic, artificial sigh of the ventilator. Brennan sat in the dim light of Maya's room, his chair pulled as close to her bed as possible, his hand clutching hers. Her skin was cool, her grip non-existent. He watched the lines on the monitor, green ghosts dancing a terrifying, fragile rhythm. He had been like this for hours, a statue carved from fear and exhaustion. The fight was over. He had lost. The grants, the charities, the desperate phone calls, all of it had been a fool's errand. The wall had proven too high. He was so lost in his grief that he didn't hear the door open at first. When he finally looked up, Dr. Evans was standing there, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. It wasn't pity. It wasn't sorrow. It was awe. "Brennan," she said, her voice a near whisper, "you need to hear this." He braced himself for another blow. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a dead monotone. I just got off the phone," she stammered, looking at the tablet in her hands as if she couldn't believe what it said. 5 minutes ago, with Sylvie Dane. Brennan Hart gave a painful lurch. Sylvie, of course. She was probably calling to have him fired from the hospital too. To finish the job. What did she want? She wanted to know Maya's exact medical needs, Dr. Evans said, her eyes wide. She wanted to know the precise cost of the Carpovex treatment, the ancillary care, the recovery protocols, everything. And then she said... The doctor took a deep breath, her gaze locking with his. She said, "Consider it handled. She's transferring the funds now, the entire amount. She said her company's biotech lab has a supply of the infusion drug on standby for research and that she's having it couriered over. Brennan, the first dose will be here in 2 hours." Brennan stared at her, his mind refusing to process the words. It felt like a dream or a cruel joke. "What? Number that's not possible." "It is, Doctor," Evans insisted, a smile finally breaking through her shock. "She's covering everything. She said, and I quote, 'Give that little girl the best care in the world and send me the bill.'" He couldn't speak. He just stared at his daughter, at the machines keeping her alive, and a single, hot tear escaped his eye and rolled down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of disbelief, of a hope so sudden and overwhelming it felt like physical pain. Someone had thrown him a rope. From the top of the cliff, a rope had come down. Meanwhile, Sylvie Dane had already moved on to her next target. Her call to Dr. Alistair Cole at Crestwood Academy was brief and brutal. "Alistair, it's Sylvie. We have a problem." Her voice was pure ice. She laid out the facts of the bullying campaign against Arya with the precision of a prosecutor, ending with the evidence of the destroyed sketchbook. "This happened under your watch, at your school, a school to which I have donated over $10 million in the last 5 years. The headmaster on the other end of the line stammered, horrified. "Sylvie, I had no idea. I assure you, we will launch a full investigation immediately." "There will be no investigation," Sylvie cut in. "There will only be a result. The students involved, starting with Paige, will be expelled today. If I hear that any of them are still on your campus by the end of the school day, you can consider my family's funding and my daughter's enrollment terminated. Have I made myself clear?" "Crystal, Sylvie," he whispered. When she hung up, she felt a grim satisfaction. It wasn't a solution, but it was a consequence. Justice, delivered with the brutal efficiency of a corporate takeover. Arya had been watching her from the other side of the office, her expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. She had never seen her mother like this. A focused storm of action, her power wielded not for profit, but like a shield. "They're going to be expelled," Sylvie said, her voice softening as she looked at her daughter. "Good," Arya whispered. She hesitated, then took a step closer. "Mom, that man, Mr. Stone, his daughter, is she okay?" Sylvie's expression tightened. "She's very sick, Arya. She's at St. Jude's." Arya's gaze dropped to the floor. She thought of Brennan's kind eyes, the way he had looked at her drawing, not at her arms, the way he had called her sweetheart. He had seen her, and all this time, his own daughter was... "We should go there," Arya said, her voice surprisingly firm. "We should go see him." Sylvie looked at her daughter, at the newfound strength in her posture. Arya wasn't asking for permission. It was a statement of moral necessity. "You're right," Sylvie said. "We should." The fallout at Crestwood was swift. Paige and her 2 friends were pulled from class and summoned to the headmaster's office. Their parents called in for an emergency meeting. There were tears and denials, followed by furious, entitled threats from Paige's father. But for the first time, his position on the Dane Bionics board meant nothing. He was utterly outranked. By 3 o'clock, the girls were gone, their lockers cleaned out, their time at the academy permanently over. Brennan was in the hospital's small, quiet chapel when he heard the soft footsteps behind him. He wasn't praying, just sitting, trying to absorb the tidal wave of hope that had crashed over him. He turned and saw Sylvie and Arya Dane standing in the doorway. He got to his feet immediately, his body tensing, his mind reeling. What were they doing here? Sylvie looked as out of place in the humble chapel as a panther in a petting zoo. She was still in her power suit, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, uncertain weariness. Arya stood beside her, her hands shoved into the pockets of her hoodie, her eyes fixed on him. "Mr. Stone," Sylvie began, her voice formal but lacking its earlier bite. We came to see how your daughter is doing." Brennan stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The anonymous benefactor, the speed, the power. It was her. "It was you," he breathed. "You're the one who paid for the treatment." Sylvie gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You showed me the truth about my daughter, the truth I was too blind and too stubborn to see for myself." Her gaze was intense, unwavering. This was the only way I knew how to say thank you. He was speechless. The words wouldn't form. The gratitude was too immense, the shock too profound. He just stood there, his world completely upended for the second time that day, this time by an act of impossible grace. Arya stepped forward, pulling one of her hands from her pocket. She held it out to him. It wasn't a gesture he was expecting. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You were the only one who didn't make me feel like a monster." Brennan looked down at her complex chrome and carbon fiber hand, then back up at her face. He reached out and took it, Her grip was firm, the mechanics within whirring softly. It wasn't cold like he expected. Just then the chapel door opened. It was a nurse. She smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Stone, we're ready. The first infusion of the Carpovex has arrived. We're taking Maya down to the treatment room now." Hope. It was real. It was here. Brennan looked from the nurse to Sylvie and Arya, two broken families standing at a crossroads, their fates suddenly, inextricably intertwined. He squeezed Arya's hand, a silent thank you of his own. "Okay," he said to the nurse, his voice thick with unshed tears. Let's go save my daughter." The walk from the chapel to the pediatric treatment wing was silent, the air thick with a fragile, unspoken truce. Brennan walked beside the nurse, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and prayer. A few paces behind, Sylvie and Arya followed, a quiet, supportive presence that felt both strange and profoundly comforting. The treatment room was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. It was new, filled with gleaming advanced machinery that hummed with quiet power. Maya was already there, looking impossibly small in the center of it all. The nurses were calm and efficient, their movements precise as they prepped the IV line for the Carpovex infusion. The drug itself was in a small, deceptively simple-looking bag, its contents glowing faintly under the specialized lights. It looked like liquid hope. Brennan went to her side immediately, taking her small, cool hand in his. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "Hey, Firefly, Daddy's here. You just rest now, okay? Help is here." Sylvie and Arya stood in the doorway, watching through the glass. Sylvie saw the scene not as a CEO analyzing a medical procedure, but as a mother. She saw the terrifying vulnerability of a child tethered to machines, and the absolute, unconditional love of a father who would burn down the world for her. It was a mirror of her own feelings for Arya, a truth she had buried under layers of ambition and control. Arya watched Brennan's gentle touch, the way he smoothed Maya's hair, and felt a pang in her chest. It was the first time she had ever truly witnessed a parent's love expressed not through gifts or expectations, but through simple, steadfast presence. After the infusion was connected and the slow, steady drip began, the head nurse gently ushered Brennan out into the small, private waiting room. "It'll be a few hours," she said softly. "We'll monitor her every second. You should try to breathe." Brennan sank into one of the chairs, his body feeling boneless with a mixture of terror and relief. Sylvie and Arya sat opposite him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the hospital. "I don't know how to thank you," Brennan finally said, looking at Sylvie. The words felt small, inadequate. There aren't words for what you've done." Sylvie looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "After Arya's accident," she began, her voice quiet and stripped of its usual authority, "I thought I had lost her. When she survived, I made a promise that I would fix what had been broken. I poured everything into creating her arms. I thought if I could build her perfect hands, I could build her a perfect life." She finally looked up, her eyes shimmering with a vulnerability he never would have thought possible. "I was a brilliant engineer, but a terrible mother. I was so focused on fixing the outside, I never stopped to look at the pain on the inside." She glanced at Arya, who was listening intently. "You didn't just show me a sketchbook, Mr. Stone. You showed me my own daughter." The formal Mr. Stone still felt strange, but the sentiment behind it was devastatingly real. He was no longer just the janitor to her. He was the man who had held up a mirror. "Call me Brennan," he said quietly. While they talked, Arya had taken a small notepad and one of her charcoal pencils from her pocket. She began to draw, her movements fluid and certain. But this time, she wasn't drawing her own pain. She was drawing a story Brennan had told her, a story he'd just recounted to Sylvie about Maya. She drew a little girl with blonde hair, asleep in a hospital bed. But the room wasn't dark or scary. It was filled with a swirling galaxy of a million tiny, glowing lights. She was drawing Maya, safe and sound, surrounded by her fireflies. She was using her art not as a shield, but as a prayer. Nearly 4 hours later, Dr. Evans appeared in the doorway, a broad, genuine smile on her face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "It's working," she said, her voice filled with a professional, joyful relief. "Her vitals are stabilizing. Her heart is responding to the bypass weaning protocols far better than we could have hoped. The initial markers show the drug is being accepted by her system." She looked directly at Brennan. "It's not a cure, not yet. It's a long road. But Brennan, this is the first step, and it's a huge one." Brennan buried his face in his hands, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief shaking his entire body. He had been so prepared for the worst that the sudden, brilliant light of hope was almost blinding. When he finally looked up, his eyes red but clear, he saw Sylvie watching him, a soft, compassionate expression on her face. Arya had stood up and was shyly holding out her notepad. He took it and looked at the drawing of Maya and the fireflies. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The immediate crisis had passed. The storm had broken. As the day faded into evening, the four of them sat in a comfortable, shared silence, 2 parents and 2 daughters. A strange, makeshift family forged in a crucible of pain and kindness. As Sylvie and Arya prepared to leave, Sylvie turned to Brennan one last time. "I made some calls this afternoon," she said, her tone back to its familiar, efficient clip. But the coldness was gone. "I looked into your professional history. What happened to you was a gross injustice." Brennan just nodded, too tired to relitigate the past. "A man with your insight and empathy shouldn't be mopping floors," she continued, her gaze direct. "My company has a charitable foundation. We fund art therapy programs for underprivileged and at-risk children all over the country. It's been underperforming. It lacks a clear vision." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It needs a new director. Someone who understands what these kids are really going through. Someone who knows that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to draw it first." Brennan stared at her, his mind struggling to keep up. A job offer, not just any job. It was his life's work, his passion, the identity that had been stolen from him. She was handing it back. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just looked from Sylvie's expectant face to Arya's hopeful one, and then through the glass wall of the waiting room to the CCU, where a team of nurses was watching over his daughter. The life-saving medicine, paid for by the woman standing in front of him, was dripping steadily into Maya's arm, chasing the monsters away. For the first time in years, he could see a future. Not just a frantic, desperate scramble to the next day, but a real, tangible future. A future where Maya was healthy. A future where he wasn't a ghost. A future where they were not just surviving, but finally healing. The next 6 months passed in a blur of cautious hope, sterile hospital rooms, and the slow, miraculous return of color to Maya's cheeks. The Carpovex treatment was not a magic wand, but it was a lifeline. Each infusion was a battle. But it was a battle Maya was finally winning, her small, stubborn body fighting its way back into the light. The grand opening of the Dane Foundation's new pediatric wing was held on a bright, crisp autumn afternoon. The building was a beautiful modern space of light-colored wood and vast windows, designed to feel less like a clinic and more like a sanctuary. And etched in elegant silver letters above the main entrance were the words, "The Maya Stone Center for Pediatric Art Therapy." A crowd of donors, doctors, and reporters had gathered in the main gallery. At the back of the room, Sylvie Dane sat not in the front row reserved for dignitaries, but on a small chair next to a vibrant, healthy-looking 7-year-old girl with bright blonde hair who was happily sketching in a notepad. Maya. Her drawing was of a girl with gleaming chrome arms, handing a flower to a girl with a big smile. On the stage, Arya Dane stood at the podium. She was poised and confident, her robotic arms resting naturally on the lectern. She wore a stylish, short-sleeved dress, her arms no longer a source of shame, but simply a part of who she was. "A lot of people think art is about creating something beautiful," Arya said, her clear voice carrying through the room. "But sometimes, it's about creating a safe place to put your pain. It's about drawing a map to find your way back to yourself. The man I'm about to introduce is the one who gave me that map." She smiled, her gaze finding a man standing just off stage. "He taught me that there is strength in what makes us different. And most importantly, he taught me that monsters can't draw. It is my honor to introduce the director of this center, Dr. Brennan Stone." Brennan stepped onto the stage to a wave of warm applause. He was no longer the ghost in the faded uniform. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit, but his eyes were the same, kind, perceptive, and filled with a quiet strength. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze lingering on Maya, who gave him a little wave, and then on Sylvie and Arya. "Thank you, Arya," he began, his voice steady. 6 months ago, I was a janitor, and I was a father who was watching his daughter die. I felt powerless, invisible, and completely alone. The room quieted, captivated by his raw honesty. I thought the world was divided into the powerful and the powerless, the lucky and the unlucky. I thought I knew what monsters looked like. They looked like disease. They looked like poverty. They looked like injustice. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. But I was wrong. What I've learned is that monsters are just stories we tell ourselves. The real world isn't made of monsters and victims. It's made of people. People who have the power to see each other, to listen, and to choose kindness over cruelty. He looked directly at Sylvie. It's made of people who, when they see a family drowning, will throw them a rope without asking for anything in return. He then looked at Arya. And it's made of brave young artists who teach us that our scars are not something to be hidden, but are proof that we have survived. Finally, his gaze rested on his daughter, Maya, and his voice softened. "This center is named for my daughter, but it is dedicated to all the children who are fighting battles no one can see. This will be a place where they can make their voices heard, not with words, but with color, with clay, and with charcoal. This is a place for them to show the world that they are not their diagnosis. They are not their trauma. They are creators." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. And creators are the most powerful people on earth. Later, after the speeches and the applause had faded, the four of them walked through the new sunlit therapy room alone. The walls were lined with art supplies. The tables were clean and ready, and the air smelled of new paint and possibility. "Well, Director," Sylvie said, a playful teasing in her voice that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "You've got your work cut out for you." "I can't wait to start," Brennan said, a deep, resonant joy in his voice. Arya had knelt beside Maya, who was showing off her sketchbook. "I like your use of color," Arya said, pointing to Maya's drawing with her prosthetic finger. "But if you blend the blue and yellow right here, you can make a really cool green for the flower stem. Want me to show you?" Maya nodded enthusiastically. "Okay." Brennan and Sylvie stood back, watching them. Arya, with her high-tech arms, gently guided Maya's small hand. The two of them bent over the page, their heads nearly touching. A girl who was saved by art was now teaching a girl who was saved by medicine. A perfect, unbroken circle of healing. Brennan looked at Sylvie, the woman he had once seen as an unmovable force of injustice, and now saw only as a friend, an ally who had shown him that miracles were possible. "Thank you, Sylvie," he said, the words finally feeling big enough. "For everything." She smiled, a real, warm smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you, Brennan," she replied. "You saved us too." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their daughters create something beautiful together. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the millions of tiny dust motes dancing in the air like a galaxy of fireflies. And that's where our story ends. But the truth is, a story like this never really ends. It echoes. It teaches us that the person you overlook today might be the one who saves you tomorrow. It reminds us that you never truly know the silent battles the people around you are fighting. So, now I want to hear from you. What part of this story resonated with you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's share in this conversation. Where in the world are you watching from today? It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We share new stories every week that are meant to inspire, to give hope, and to remind us of the quiet heroes all around us. Thank you for being here, for watching, and for being a part of this community. Remember to be kind, because a single act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, can be the one thing that changes their world forever.